let's jump in. I'm looking, there we go. So what was your path? I always like to say to parents, the one thing we can be certain of is our children don't follow our paths, but I'm sort of curious about your path and how you got to being a soil microbial ecologist.
Well, thanks everyone, both in attendance in person and online. So I did not come from a line of microbial ecologists. My parents are psychologists and now a county judge. But one of the things that they really did from an early age is instill this love of being outside. We spent a lot of time hiking through forests or being on the lakes growing up in Minnesota. So I always knew that I loved being outside. But I had really no idea that research and being a microbial ecologist was a job that I could have. I thought, like a lot of students, that, hey, I really like science, so I think I will be a medical doctor because that's what people who are good at science do. And it wasn't until my first semester of college that I started taking a biology class, and my professor said, you seem to really like this. Would you be interested in coming and working with me down in Panama, starting to study the influence of ants on our ecosystems in tropical forests? And at first I said, no, I don't think I want to do that, because he made it sound like it was going to be really awful. And like he said, maybe we won't have showers for 6 weeks. And I was like, I don't know, that sounds okay. But I eventually decided to go for it, and it changed my life. And it really convinced me that a job where I get to explore this hidden complexity of the world and enjoy creative thought is so fulfilling. So it really encouraged me to keep exploring.
And Panama ended up in your blood.
It did, yeah.
You did your PhD down there.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. Yep, I kept coming back.
And did you ever get a shower?
Yeah, one actually, no, a couple times. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. I got to work at a place called Barrow, Colorado Island, which is owned by the Smithsonian, and it's kind of like a resort in terms of the science world. It's incredible. They have wonderful facilities there, and it's probably the most studied forest in the world. So it was a wonderful place to grow up in.
And they have showers.
And they have showers.
All right, so that's how you got into the business, as it were, and now you're doing work on soils. And I think people understand generally why soils are important, but what's the sort of global picture in terms of their importance for human well-being?
Sure. I think that soils are the foundation of everything. I mean, it's literally what we build our lives on, but it's also 95% of our food comes from our soil ecosystem. Soils are responsible for filtering and cleaning most of our water. They keep us healthy. They're a huge carbon store that is often underappreciated. So there's so much that soils do for us. But the other thing that really makes me excited and I'm kind of captivated by is that they are incredibly complex, and there's so much diversity there. I like to think of it as this tropical forest that's existing underneath our feet that kind of looks like, if you could zoom in, it looks like a sponge. It has all these nooks and crannies with lots of organisms living all over. And we know far more about the surface of the moon than we do about soil. So in a lot of ways, it's job security for me, because there are so many questions to ask, and it will take many lifetimes of work to really uncover this incredible world.
Yeah, and recent advances in molecular biology have made it possible to start rather rapidly getting at that diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true all over. You know, we all hear now so much more about microbiomes, and you might think, well, why do we know more about our microbiome now? And it's because we, as a scientific field, have developed this ability to pull the DNA out of microbes and identify it. So now in an area where we used to have to try to grow things on plates of agar that most of the bacteria wouldn't grow, now we can use these molecular techniques and know so much more.
And so people understand that's the last 10 years, probably the last 5, and rapid sequencers and all those, really cool tools.
Yeah, it's a really great time. I think it's not a surprise that now is why I'm in it, because there's so much innovation happening so rapidly.
It's the cutting edge, right? Which is fantastic. Soils are disappearing, right? I think the number, if I don't look down, let's see if I get it right, 30 football fields every 30 soccer fields, I was right on football, every minute, right, are being lost. And, why are soils so stressed out?
Yeah, it's kind of sad as a soil scientist to hear that fact that we're losing so much of our soil. And there's a huge variety of factors that contribute to our loss of soil. The biggest thing is that we are kind of over intensively managing our fields. One of the biggest things we see that hurts our soil is that we're converting land that used to have maybe forested systems into agricultural systems. And in that process, we're getting rid of these deep, long-lasting, heavy-rooted trees that now all of a sudden expose soil to more erosion. At the same time, we are trying to grow more out of our soils. And so to do that, we have to add more to our soils, things like nutrients, herbicides, pesticides. And while those are really important because they help us grow food, it's kind of a short-term gain for a long-term consequence, because most of those items actually kill the microbiome. And it's microbes that are kind of gluing themselves together that hold soil in place. And unfortunately, when we add these compounds, or if we come in with like really heavy machinery and compact our soil, it causes them to be much more susceptible to erosion.
Right. So the glue, we're getting, the microbiome is the glue.
It really is. Yep, exactly.
And, you know, there are all sorts of global change, right? The one I think most of us think of when we say global change these days is climate change, but there's land conversion, there's all sorts of, you know, desertification, and more human impacts through the addition, as you say, of exogenous materials.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering, how do the global change drivers amplify what you're seeing with farming practices?
Sure. So, you know, we have our soils, we're asking a lot of them, we're doing these, you know, intensive management practices, but then on top of that, we're getting really big global change. And I think we all know this big overarching fact that we have warming temperatures globally. And that is causing all these subsequent effects that have really strong impacts on our soil. I think one of the biggest things we see is that as our temperatures are warming, it's really changing the precipitation patterns. So one of the big things we're seeing is that a lot of areas are getting bigger periods of drought. And soil really likes to be moist. It likes to be kind of like the you know, texture of a wrung out sponge. That's when it's its healthiest and happiest. And as it dries, it becomes more susceptible to erosion. You know, you get these windstorms and it starts to blow away. And so some of us think about the Dust Bowl imagery from the past and think, okay, that's a historic problem. But just 2 weeks ago, I think Illinois was dealing with really dry conditions. We didn't have lots of plant cover because it's early in the cropping season. And we were getting these huge dust storms that caused tons of accidents. So this is a very real problem that's happening currently, and drought is a big part of that. At the same time, we have these periods of drought followed by these big intense storms. So if you are a really dry soil, when storms come in, it's not easy to absorb that water. Instead, it hits this dry, compacted land, it runs off into our water systems, and that can be really taxing because soil's where our nutrients are. So if you lose that topsoil, now you have to put more nutrients back in. That's costly. And at the same time, our water systems are getting too much sediment in them that can affect our water life. And also it can be taxing on our industries. You know, our ability to filter water is decreased, our dams become stressed. So it's kind of this unfortunate constant pressure. Yeah.
and that also affects hydropower, because the lakes that we dam up and then drain fill up with sediment.
Absolutely.
And I was just out in California, and I was out in the chaparral, and it was gorgeous because it was in this incredible, you know, once every 20 years bloom.
Yeah.
But everybody I talked to said, have you heard about the snowpack?
Yeah.
Up in the Sierras, right? So water comes down both in the winter and the summer and causes these remarkable floods in a place that's been in a drought for a decade.
Exactly. Yep. So it's really those like changing what used to be kind of average conditions to being more boom and bust and severe. Unfortunately, at the same time, you know, here in the Hudson Valley, we experienced a very mild winter. And while for us, sometimes that can feel great because we're not dealing with freezing cold, there are other organisms that really enjoy that lack of cold weather. And that in particular is true of invertebrate pests. We really rely on hard freezes because that's what kills these pest pressures over winter. But when we have these mild winters, what ends up happening is that pests are able to keep reproducing, or they don't completely die off. And then, you know, you can imagine if you're trying to grow a bunch of crops that all of a sudden we have these big new pressures coming in, and that can really exacerbate, you know, our need to more intensively manage our systems, add herbicides, add pesticides. And then we have this changing seasonality where maybe what used to be our first flower in late May is coming earlier. And then that kind of causes this asynchrony with pollinators, which again is just more effort for people who are, you know, managing the land. You have to go in and maybe manually pollinate when we used to have nature doing those jobs.
Yeah. And we also have this, you know, like this year where we had, you know, early blooms and then freeze.
Yep.
And so you get a system that hasn't adapted to the new realities.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So unfortunately, climate change is not great for our soil systems.
All right. So this was not accidental. Jane has sort of enumerated for you all these different threats. And so one of the challenges, I think, of science is understanding not just individual threats, but the deep interactions between and among those threats. And if you guys have gone for walks around here, you might get up to our monitoring field after the Fern Glen. You go up the hill, sort of bear to your right. On your left is the monitoring field, and you might have seen some things up there that are part of Jane's stressed out soils experimentation. And I'd love it if you could sort of explain what you're doing and why you're doing it
for sure
to this group of people.
Yeah, so you'll hear me for the next, hopefully 5 to 10 years, talk about SOS, or stressed out soils. This is a project I have going on right now just at Cary, but we're hoping to expand it as well. And the idea of this is that global climate change is this very interactive process. You know, it's not that we're just going to get warming temperatures or just having a drought, right? These things will happen at the same time. And at the same time, we're also going to be adding things to our soils like herbicides or pesticides, antibiotics. So the goal of my study is to understand what happens when these different stressors hit our soil at the same time. You know, science has done a really good job of looking at how individual stressors might be affecting our ecosystems, but less than 2% of all studies in soils have ever looked at more than 2 factors. So the goal of my study is to dramatically increase that by having at least 5 factors, and hopefully to grow that more and more. To really start to understand what happens when these things happen in concert. And one of the big things I expect to find is that even though we call it stressors and that might have a negative connotation, actually some of these factors might cancel each other out or maybe even be kind of beneficial. And one example of that is warming generally helps create more microbial activity, but antibiotics causes less microbial activity. So when they come together, do they cancel each other out, or does it cause a new normal? It's hard to say. So for those of you, I think online you can see this, but those of you in the audience, these plots are, like Josh said, here at the Cary campus. You can see these structures that, to me, they kind of look like the cone you put on a dog, but they're actually called a passive warming chamber. And they're at these angles, and what they do is they allow for us to capture that radiant heat that naturally comes off of the Earth's systems, or out of our soil, more or less. And it keeps the environment inside about 2 degrees warmer. So it's kind of like a mini greenhouse effect. But we keep them open so that natural gases can exchange. We're not creating this also CO2 increase experiment.
But you could.
But we could. And then you can also see that there are these things with stilts with little roofs over them. Those are causing a 70% decrease in precipitation. So kind of mimicking what a drought would be like. And you can't tell necessarily from this photo, but some of these plots also have antibacterials, antifungals, and we'll soon have insecticides, pesticides on them. And we'll be studying all of these different factors together.
Which is exciting.
Yeah, very.
And when you say you'd like to do it somewhere else,
yeah,
I know you're involved with a couple networks.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe since I think we're running good time.
Good.
So we have a chance to just freelance a bit.
Yeah.
What are those networks, and how would you sort of make this a network project?
Sure. One thing that we constantly see with soils is that where you are really makes a big difference on how you manage.
Geographic.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. And this isn't surprising, right? You know, people are not growing the same crops here as they are maybe in the middle of Mexico. We have different climate.
West Africa, yeah.
Exactly. So I really am excited about working with land managers in the Hudson Valley, but I also want to know what happens all over the place. So some of the places I have worked in the past have been out in Idaho, which has very similar temperature, but very dry compared to the Northeast area. So it would be really interesting to see, are the responses of soils in the Northeast very similar to those out West? Similarly, I do some work down in Florida, and they have quite similar rainfall to us, but obviously quite warmer weather. So is that kind of changing that? At the same time, I'm part of this big new network that started up that's called, oh, it's not the best name, it's called Dragnet, but it means disturbance responses in ag. And so these, right next to these plots are another set of plots that have fertilizer and tillage added to them. And what we've done is we have done this exact same experiment in 90 different locations in 45 countries around the world to really start to understand, when we add nutrients or when we're tilling and disturbing our soil, how consistent are the soil responses? Can we create general management plans? Probably not for the whole globe, right, but how general can we be and how site specific? And that's going to be really exciting to be a part of. And I'm excited that Cary gets to be at the center of that.
Yeah, and for those of you who are not scientists, nobody does science all by themselves anymore. If you look at a scientific paper, 4 or 5 authors is sort of normal. 30 or 40 authors is not uncommon. And these global networks, whether it's this network or the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network that Kathy Weathers, another Cary scientist, helped found, they are a remarkable way to add incredible leverage to science, because you have these repeated processes that are done in a very systematic way. Yep. And then you can start, it gives you even more geographic and soil variables and moisture variables, or lake depth, and so on and so forth. So yeah, these network science, as we call it, is increasingly important. So it's a really great part of what Jane's brought to Cary. Another thing that you're working on, which is a sort of subset of this and sort of preceded it, was the whole question of antibiotics in soils.
Yep.
And first, can you explain how they get there?
Absolutely.
And then can you explain what happens when they get there?
Sure. So probably most of us don't immediately think about soils when we hear the word antibiotics. But I think it's really important to remember that almost all the antibiotics that we create today are either directly found in soil or at least inspired by compounds that occur in soil. So antibiotics are actually a very natural thing. Soils, the microbes in soil and all over the place, create them as a way to defend and communicate with each other. So it's not uncommon to find antibiotics in our soil ecosystems. The problem is, we as humans, our activity is dramatically increasing the rates of antibiotics in our ecosystems. Now, we do this through a wide variety of ways. One is just through kind of our normal use of antibiotics. Most of us, when we take a course of antibiotics, our body can't break down all of that compound and use it. So it's a little unglamorous, but it kind of comes in one end and goes out the other, primarily through our water systems. And work by Emma Rosie here has really kind of revolutionized our understanding of some of the effects this has on aquatic systems. But at the same time, as they're kind of flushing through our water systems, a lot of our wastewater treatment plants cannot fully remove antibiotics from the system. So it goes into our soil ecosystems. Similarly, if we don't properly dispose of our pharmaceuticals, they can go into landfills, and that's another way they leach into our ecosystem. Another way that I think is really under-recognized is that a huge amount of seeds and cropping systems use antibiotics pretty commonly. If you buy turf seed, odds are it is coated in an antifungal. That's because they're easy for fungi to try to attack. So we want to protect those seeds so that you don't always have to buy more and more. But at the same time, some of that will slough off the seed, go into your soil system. It's a pretty common way for it to enter. And also things like fruit systems. they have to deal with pathogens a lot. So very commonly, a couple times a year, things like apple orchards will spray some type of antifungal, antimicrobial to limit infections. It's a tough problem, right? Like, because that does enter into our ecosystems, maybe with unintended consequences, but also we need to make sure we have crops and food. So it's somewhat a tough conundrum to be in. That being said, the biggest way that antibiotics enter into our ecosystems is through livestock. So about 80% of all of the antibiotics we produce go into our livestock. That's because, one, we're trying to treat or prevent disease. You can imagine when you have lots of animals congregated together, if somebody gets sick, it's quick to spread, and then that's a huge loss of money, time, potential animals. So we try to limit that spread. But we also know that throughout the world, we use low doses of antibiotics to promote growth. And it's really kind of incredible how just a little bit of this compound can promote growth from just a couple percentage to almost 40% bigger animals. So it's a big reason to use it. But just like us, these animals aren't able to fully metabolize that product. So when they're out in the field, they might be eliminating, and those
in
compounds.
one end out the other.
Yep, in one end, out the other, and they enter into our soil systems.
And does that also come about because we spread manure?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
that this sort of organic substance may be laced with antibiotics if we're not getting it from an organic farm that doesn't use antibiotics.
Exactly, exactly. There are some ways that we can try to treat manure to limit some of that, but for the most part, yes, it's still compound antibiotic residues are frequently found in our systems.
Yeah, and then you get impacts on the soil microbiome from all that antibiotics going into the soil, which they are not adapted.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not surprising that when you have antibiotics, they work and they kill microbes in the soil. That's what their job is. And so some of the studies we see is when you either add them directly to the soil, or if you're giving it to the cow and then taking their manure, it's a really glamorous job, as you can imagine, standing behind a cow, making sure that you collect all of your soil and manure. But it causes about a 25 to 50% decrease in the active microbiome, which is rough because our soils really need that healthy microbiome to stay productive and do the natural kind of filtering and ecosystem processes.
So it has the sort of same parallel to the first set of global change that you talked about, in that it's a short-term gain, 40% more cow to harvest, and a long-term cost.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Another cost there, the term you use, which I love, is the resistome. But another cost is the development of antibiotic resistance.
Absolutely.
And you've done some work on that too. And
definitely.
Would love to know more about it.
For sure. Well, so we have tons of different studies looking at the impacts of antibiotics on our soil systems. And so before I jump into the whole resistome, I'll just briefly mention that we see not just effects on what's living in the microbiome or in the soil, but we see changes in the microbial life, but we also see changes in the whole food web. In fact, oftentimes these antibiotic compounds that we think of as being antimicrobial can affect many more organisms. And normally what we see is that herbivores, or those really important primary consumers, things like mites, millipedes, isopods, all of them are killed off when antibiotics enter into the ecosystem. That being said, it's this really interesting trophic dynamic, because now you have all these easy to access prey. So predators end up increasing in the short term because now they have food. And so we get these kind of interesting food web effects. And when you knock out your microbiome and you change your food webs, you have these big ecosystem consequences. One of the big things we see is that it changes the nutrient availability in soils. We do see this short-term pulse of increased nitrogen, which for many of us as farmers or maybe soil managers, we know that, oh, that sounds like a good effect. And that's probably because you've killed all these microbes and they've kind of expelled the nitrogen that was in them, but it doesn't last in the system very long. It gets leached out pretty quickly. So it's not like we're creating a fertilizer effect. At the same time, as we mentioned, we kill off all that microbial life, and it decreases that structural integrity of our soil. So now it can't hold on to water nearly as well as it used to. And then that means we have to spend more time adding water to the system or managing it more intensively. So that's pretty rough. We also see one of the big effects that I think is really interesting is that the efficiency of the microbes that survive decreases. And maybe this is a little bit of an obscure concept, but I like to think of it as, okay, let's say we all went out to a track and I said, you can either walk around the track one time or you can run around the track. Either way, you're doing one lap, right? But if you're running, you're going to be working harder, you're going to be breathing harder, you're burning more calories. Well, that's what antibiotics do to the soil. They make the surviving microbes work a lot harder just to survive. So that can be a big issue because then they need more nutrients. That becomes a bigger CO2 release because they're working hard and breathing out CO2 just like us. And so the ability for them to maybe hold on to carbon decreases. And because soil is so important for our carbon stores, decreasing that can be a big issue. But that's a long answer to get eventually
to the resistance.
To the resistance. So, you know, when we talk about antibiotics, I think it's natural for us to also consider antibiotic resistance, because when these compounds come in, some organisms are able to still last. They're surviving. So one of the really big studies that I'm finally finishing up now is called Mapping the Resistome here in the United States. And so like we think of microbiome, resistome really means the diversity of antibiotic resistance in our soil systems. So I mentioned earlier, antibiotics are naturally occurring. So is antibiotic resistance. That's kind of a natural defense mechanism microbes have. But surprisingly, we don't have a great idea of what is normal or baseline antibiotic resistance in our environment. And I think that's a really important thing for us to understand, because if we are worried about antibiotic resistance infections, which we should be, because it's estimated that in 2019 alone, 5 million people died from antibiotic resistant infections. And I think in the US, it's expected to cost us $100 trillion by 2050 to fight antibiotic resistance. So it's a big problem. But we don't really understand the natural part of antibiotic resistance. So a big study we did is we went to 220 soils all around the United States that were from all different types of ecosystems. They were in forested systems, croplands, pasture lands, people's lawns, dry lands, boreal forests. We wanted to understand what is the average amount of antibiotic resistance in these ecosystems. So if you're looking at this map here, you can see these little dots on sticks represent all the places we went and sampled. And if they're purple, that's kind of an unmanaged or semi-natural system. And if they're green, that's a more managed kind of human-intensive system. And what we see consistently is that areas where humans are managing, interacting quite a bit with the ecosystem, we have about 47% more antibiotic resistance on average. And I think that is concerning potentially, because that tells us that what we're doing is accelerating that process. We also see that the types of resistance are different. So it just kind of tells me that we are decoupling the natural process and kind of creating a different kind of normal baseline for what a managed system looks like. And the fact that there's more could mean that our chances of spillover into human or animals increases. And I think one of the most surprising results that we found is that it wasn't our livestock farms that had the most resistance. It was actually human lawns, like our lawns in our backyard, that had the highest amounts of antibiotic resistance.
Because we're putting so many fungicides and herbicides. So.
I don't know
Okay.
is the answer yet.
More
we don't
research.
know. We really have to figure out what that is. I mean, my instinct is yes, we do tend to manage our lawns quite a bit intensively. So that's probably accelerating some of these processes, but it's hard to know. Maybe we're also providing resistance from our own lives. And so it's a really exciting, but a little bit concerning result to have found.
Yeah, one of my favorite Cary Scientist quotes of the month was Stuart Pickett, who's one of our senior scientists who works on urban ecosystems, hence knows about lawns, and has worked with Peter Groffman, who also has published a lot of work on on how lawns all look the same, but they aren't.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
ecologically interesting topic. But Stewart was quoted in Martha Stewart Living on the homogeneity of lawn ecology. And so Cary scientists get quoted in very unusual places. But this issue of antibiotics is really important because certainly with animals, we feed them antibiotics that are in the same classes of antibiotics that we take.
Yeah.
So is there the potential for that resistance in the soil to then spill back to the animals and then spill over to us?
Yeah, there's definitely that potential. I think it's one of the biggest things we've highlighted in this world. Maybe many of you have heard of the concept of One Health, where our health is related to animal health, is related to our ecosystem health. And I think that's a good concept to think about because that's such a big concern of we don't want to create lots of resistance in animals because it can spill over. We, at least in the US and in a lot of Europe, they have limited the use of any antibiotics that are used in human systems. In particular, we say you cannot use the growth promoting style of antibiotics that are used in human health. So that's a good step forward. That being said, antibiotic resistance is not just something that we can keep in the US. So other places don't have as strict of regulations that can accelerate that potential spillover.
And some of the most commonly used antibiotics in animals are some of the most damaging to microbiomes, if I remember that paper correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely the case. And that's the hard trade-off is we've said, oh, use this antibiotic because it's not used in human systems, so it's our healthier choice. But it ends up actually affecting the function and health of our soils the most. And so then it's hard to determine what's the right choice in that setting.
Right. And you know, that sort of leads me to my last formal question. And we've already got some questions from the audience in the laptop, in the iPad. But you know, I know you are a fanatical composter.
Yep.
And you are an evangelist for composting, and have, in the short time you've been here, Jane arrived in the middle of the pandemic. So she got here a year and a half ago, but you somehow managed to integrate yourself into the Hudson Valley community and given many different lectures and lessons and demonstrations on composting. But what other things can we do to make our soils healthier?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's hard sometimes to give these talks because when you talk about stressed out soils, it's depressing. Yeah, guess what? It's stressful. But the other reason I love soil is that it's this thing that we can interact with and we can make lots of decisions. And it's also something that we can make at individual scales, and then we can scale all the way up to, you know, big systems, which sometimes global change can feel really overwhelming, like we can't individually do much. As you mentioned, composting is a really great way to take care of your soils for multiple reasons. The reason composting is so important is that about 30 to 40% of all of the food we produce goes to waste. And often that means it's thrown in the trash and then it moves to landfills. And normally, if we were composting, that would be broken down through aerobic, normal pathways that we kind of naturally have in our ecosystems. When it goes into a landfill, it goes into anaerobic digestion. And that means that we create methane, which is a much more potent gas than what CO2 is. I think it's about 20 times more potent. So we're wasting food. We're wasting the resources that went into growing that food. We're wasting the resources that got it to our houses. And then we're putting it in a landfill that creates a really bad, you know, greenhouse gas. So when we can take that food that is compostable and other items, it's not just food, things like cardboard or paper, newspapers, our lawn, our clippings, all of this can be composted and go through this aerobic process, which, yes, it does create CO2, but not nearly as much. And it's kind of just controlling the decomposition process and kind of keeping a lot of what could be pretty harmful out of our landfills. So I love that option because it's something we can all do at our house. It's an easy step for us.
And just before we get on to other things we can do, just so people know, the oxic in anoxic is oxygen.
Yep.
Right. And so it's when you compost, you let oxygen in, and when you don't compost and you seal it over, I think the term over it is cap the landfill, there's no oxygen, so it produces methane, which is carbon based, carbon and hydrogen based.
Yeah, and really tough.
And not good stuff. And so what else can we do to make our soils better at home?
So I think that a lot of times we talk about soil health and we think about it in our ag systems. And again, we sometimes feel separated from that. But what I think is interesting about soil health is the same principles that I would tell a farmer are the same ones that I could tell you about your home garden or your lawn. And that's that we want to, first of all, if you want healthy soil, you should not see it very often. So that means keeping it covered. In the winter, the options are you can mulch over it, or you could put kind of your leaves. If you have a garden, you can put your leaves out there. Or sometimes we have the option to grow something called a cover crop, which the real purpose of a cover crop is just to keep living plant material on the soil. It's not often a crop that we call a cash crop that we're actually trying to sell. And those are things that you could do in your own home garden. You can also rotate the plants. When you ask soil to keep growing the same plant over and over again, it pulls those nutrients out and then it requires us to put more back in. But if you rotate them, the natural differences in what those plants need will allow the soil to kind of grow happily. The other thing that Stuart brought up just recently is we have this kind of obsession in the US with these beautiful Kentucky bluegrass style, simple cut lawns, monocultures, which, we talk about, oh, monocultures in agriculture sounds so bad, but we do it all in our own lawns, and really considering changing how we manage our lawns to be more towards a native prairie. And diversity is really key there. The more diverse organisms you can put in your lawn systems, the happier the soil is. That's because these plants, they are kind of like a drip of nutrients into them, and they all have their own unique cocktail. So when you can have lots of different plants, it feeds diverse microbes. They grow happily, keeps things in place. They often actually have much deeper roots, which normal kind of lawn cover turf grass doesn't have very deep roots, which makes soil more susceptible to erosion. So those big, deep rooting plants are great. So all of those are really great steps.
Buy your vegetables from an organic farm that practices sustainable practices.
Yeah, or the new trend that people like to talk about is regenerating or regenerative farming. And it's a really blanket term, but it basically just means let's try to farm, let's try to grow our food systems in a way that's more in tune with natural processes. So when we are managing our farms for soil health, that's regenerative. If we're doing rotational cropping, that's regenerative. It's lots of things that
and
fit.
One of your side projects, because you really don't have enough to do with your time, is working with Scenic Hudson to look at carbon storage and regenerative agriculture in the Hudson Valley Carbon to try and see whether there are ways to do that at a slightly larger scale.
Absolutely. The answer for a lot of these things is that it's not going to be super easy, and what works here is maybe not going to work nearby. So we have to really think about how we study our soils, and we have to sample a lot, and we have to try lots of different techniques. But what's really great, particularly in the Hudson Valley, is that people are really excited about soil health. They're really excited about doing the right steps for keeping nature, happy and healthy. And it's been really fun to work with lots of growers in this region who are enthused about being experimental and trying things out. Right. But that being said, we can't be asking just our land managers to be making big sacrifices and being really experimental. That could mean some economic hardships. So we need to figure out how we can incentivize and make sure that happy, healthy soil choices are also viable life choices.
And I think it's also being willing to pay a little more for our vegetables because it may take a little more to make them.
Yep, absolutely.
So there's that. All right, so I've got some questions, as I think some of you know, because during this long pandemic, we have asked people to give us questions up front. And so I'm going to ask Jane a couple questions from, we'll get to the audience, a couple questions from pre-registration, and then perhaps a question or two from people out in the ether, and then a couple questions from the audience. So one of the questions Peyton asked, do you think it's possible to make long-term sustainable, positive change in soil health without returning animals to the land?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And it gets back to that regenerative farming idea that historically, the way we might manage is for a smaller scale, and that would involve growing some crops, maybe having some agroforestry systems, but then also animals integrated that we would move around, kind of this holistic view. That's pretty hard sometimes to scale up because the machinery to run a dairy farm is not the same to harvest your corn, right? So it is not an easy adjustment. And I do think there are ways that we can be good stewards to our soil that don't require animals to return. Things like planting cover crops, reducing tillage. Those things don't necessarily require an animal, but I do think that, while cows can be a really taxing thing on the environment, there are ways to manage them in a way that's more sustainable and actually really beneficial for soil health. One of the things that naturally ruminants and our herbivores do is they kind of graze just the top of plants, and actually that process encourages plants to grow more. So it's not that animals on our farms or in our land is a negative thing all the time, but I think that there's going to be some balancing, because it's going to be hard to meet our global food demands by transitioning everyone to these highly integrated systems.
And what's the role of biochar? Because I know that's something that we're hearing more and more about.
Yeah, so maybe some of you all have heard of biochar. It's basically this process of heating up organic compounds, things like manure, but also, wood substrates, the husks of corn, and doing this extreme heat treatment to them that they become charred. And then it is considered this very stable carbon substrate. And people on one end of the extreme are like, this is going to solve carbon cycling because we can take that and bury it underground and it will stay around for a long time. I think that's a little overzealous. Yeah, there are benefits of biochar, but the jury is definitely still out. Sometimes when we add it in there, it allows, it's easier for plants to access nutrients, but other times biochar can be really sticky and it holds on to nutrients. So it almost is competing with plants. Sometimes it can be an attractor to heavy metals, which is good. It can pull them out, but at the same time, sometimes it's actually contaminated itself. So it can be a source. Right? So it's unfortunate that I can't give you a great straight answer, but I think there's a time and a place for biochar. The real big problem is that the scale at which we could ramp up biochar would be very energy intensive. It's not a cheap thing to create biochar. So, while we're, putting all this carbon below ground, we're using all this carbon to create it in the first place.
So another question that came in was from the web audience, sort of combines two things. First of which is, how long do those antibiotics linger in the soil? Mm-hmm. And then does composting break them down?
Oh, such a good question. I'm glad that somebody asked that. Antibiotics are really variable, and like almost everything in soil, it depends. But one of the good things about most antibiotic compounds is that they have a short half-life, or they break down relatively quickly. In fact, a lot of the compounds that we use, in general, it's about a week, and they can be fully broken down. The thing that I'm a little more concerned about is, while the compound may not stick around, the antibiotic resistance does. So that we actually don't have an idea of how long antibiotic resistance stays in our system. It's one of the big questions I hope to ask with my research is, okay, we had a cow that had its manure placement in the field, that antibiotic gets in, increases resistance in that soil. How long does that resistance signature keep showing up? And unfortunately, it can be, so far, really long time. Now, compost potentially could help with some of that. It's a really diverse microbial community when you have good, healthy compost. And so some of those microbes might be able to help break down and degrade that antibiotic. One thing that I think is a really cool result, though, is that earthworms, which are like one of nature's just miracle little organisms out there, we found, a colleague of mine found that when they added earthworms to the soil, it actually was able to eliminate a lot of the antibiotic resistance. As they're going through consuming, as it goes through the earthworm's kind of whole digestive system, somehow it breaks down the antibiotic resistance. So maybe earthworms might be a big way to decrease this contamination problem.
Which is a bit of a quandary in the Northeast, where all our earthworms are introduced in invasive species.
I know.
Glaciers clear them out. So, that gets back to the complexities of invasive species may have value, and we can't always just bin them into good and bad, right?
Exactly.
All right, so I'm going to do one more question from here, and then some.
Sure.
So there's a question about orchards and old soils, but I think it's a sort of a broader question. How long does it take when you've been abusing your soils and putting herbicides and pesticides on them and spraying things on them for the soils to start to recover? I know there's some guidelines with organic gardening, organic farming, how long you have to wait. But I was just curious from a scientific perspective, what's the time frame over which soils recover?
Yeah, it's kind of depends on the metric that you're looking at. So when we think about organic farming, normally I think it's between 5 to maybe it's 3 to 5 years before that you have to have not added any pesticide on that before you can start to consider it organic. But before that, you can say, well, we're transitioning organic. So yes, we're not adding it, but historically there might be some left. That being said, as I mentioned, antibiotics can rapidly leave the soil. So as soon as you stop introducing them, you could be back to not a lot of contamination in just a couple weeks. Things like...
and does the microbiome recover that quickly as well?
Well, that's a good question.
If you put compost on it, it does, right?
Yeah, but also, what we've done in some of our studies out in the field is we actually see within, after a month, the microbiome does recover. Unfortunately, when you stress it with multiple things, it doesn't require nearly as quickly. So it kind of depends, like, is it just antibiotics that the soil is experiencing? Yeah, the microbiome can recover, but is it getting that plus a drought? It's going to take a little bit longer. What is a little bit tough to know is that topsoil, that thing that we started up talking about how we're losing 30 soccer fields every minute, it takes about 500 years to grow an inch naturally. Right. So it's not, it's renewable. Like it's not that renewable. So it definitely takes a long time. Now, they were talking specifically about orchards. Many of us maybe have heard about orchards as being an issue because we at least used to spray them with arsenic and heavy metals as a way to decrease pests in the system. And that can take a really long time to be able to kind of bring back to a healthy level. But there are really cool things like phytoremediation, which is a term for plants that can pull those compounds out of the soil. Sunflowers are really good phytoremediators. So maybe if you are having a lot of lead in your system, you put lots of sunflowers.
But then you probably don't want to eat the sunflowers.
Well, yeah, you probably shouldn't
want to make oil from them.
But at least they're bright and sunny and happy for a while.
Exactly. All right. So I saw a question here and a question there. And then one there and one up the back. So state your question. I'm going to repeat it for the people who are virtual. And then Jane will answer. Please.
Sure.
Okay, so what is the definition of microbiomes? What are the critters in a microbiome?
So microbiome it's a really broad term, but it just means the entire community of microbes in a given environment. So we have a microbiome inside of us, meaning we have all these microbial organisms that live in us, but we have a microbiome on top of us because we have microbes that live on our skin. And then we are surrounded by a microbiome because this auditorium has its own microbiome. So it's really just it's a term for the community of microbes that live in some given defined environment. And we often talk about the whole community of microbes because microbial life is just so darn diverse that we aren't normally talking about one species of microbes. Right. Thank you for the question. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
yeah.
Right. So we have a question about how jumping worms impact soil, and you have to talk about Olea and what that means.
yeah.
All that.
Yeah. So there's a kind of growing issue in this area of a newer type of worm called the jumping worm, and it is an aptly named because if you see it out there, they are just wiggling all over the place, jumping around. They don't behave like the traditional European earthworm that most of us think of when we think about a soil earthworm. What they do is they're primarily staying in what we call the O layer, or this organic layer, the very top layer of our soil. And they don't do the kind of traditional burrowing and creating nice tunnels that allow for aeration and water flow. They wiggle around and they disrupt the soil, and then that causes that loss and kind of vulnerability of that topsoil, which has lots of microbial life and lots of nutrients. And so I think, unfortunately, you know, odds are very high that the jumping worm is not going to be some great savior to something like microbial communities. So I think that's going to be something that we really need to figure out how we're going to manage. And I don't know how we're going to do that.
Yeah. Question here, and then what? First in front, and then in back. Yeah.
If you have any information on the potential benefits of green burials for soil regeneration.
Okay, so the question is, it's getting a little bit off topic, but not so far. So there's a movement to wrap yourself when you die, to have somebody wrap you in gauze and bury you without anything around you, and then you go naturally back into the soil. And the question is that regenerative, right? Is that a good way to enrich soils, in addition to being a way that doesn't require a lot of carbon, to dispose of a body?
So can you, I don't think that I think my mic is it working now?
Yeah, sure.
I'm gonna fire this. Great. All right. So it's a great question. There are pros and cons to it. The pros of this green burial is that the process of preserving humans can be pretty intensive, right? We embalm, we add all these compounds. We also put ourselves in these like laminate boxes that have, like, they're not going to break down, right? That's why we chose that, because we don't want us to decompose. So that can be a big tax on the environment. That being said, I think there's some things about green burials that are complicated. One, it does require quite a bit of land use, because as opposed to other options where we aren't having to, we have to decide that we're going to convert this land and use it as a burial location. And that might mean disrupting land that could be used for other things. We do, though, naturally decompose, so we could provide nutrients back to the system, which could be beneficial. But at the same time, we also can be filled with our own compounds that, you know, if we're on antibiotics or different types of medicines, those will break down and enter into the ecosystem. Depending on how close we are to waterways, that can be that's a big limitation in where you could do a green burial, because we don't want huge nutrient pulses to be entering into our soil system or into our waterways and creating this eutrophication effect. So it's a complicated answer. I'd love to say that, like, oh, it's the best choice, but I don't know if it is. I think there's certainly benefits to that compared to our traditional process of being very intensive in the way that we prepare bodies. But I think it's going to be an interesting kind of revolution that we'll see. So it's a good question. Thanks for asking it.
And the last question is going to be in back, and I'm sorry, but we're already over time.
Yeah.
My question has to do with antibiotic dairy waste.
Yep.
In order to avoid spreading dairy in your frozen fields, dairy farmers in the Northeast are being encouraged to create and construct large storage facilities.
Yep.
And my question has to do with, if you know whether those kinds of storage facilities lend themselves to breaking down compounds like antibiotics and other unwanted.
So repeat the question.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was about how we manage particularly dairy manure here in the Northeast. especially in the frozen months, we're being encouraged not to add manure out to your fields. You can imagine it's not going to do much on a frozen ground. So there are storage facilities and different ways of managing your waste in that. And I'm glad you asked, because I work mostly with dairy farmers, so I have quite a few thoughts about all this. There are different ways. There's an option to do digestion. That's a one way that we manage manure. And in that process, it creates oftentimes really high heat. And that actually can be a good way for breaking down antibiotic compounds. They're rapidly decomposed when we have high heat. So I think that's one of the positive ways that we could potentially limit the introduction of these compounds. I do think that not spreading manure on frozen fields is a really good choice, but manure storage is a really hard problem. Each cow can produce about 130 pounds of manure every single day. So it's a lot of crap to deal with, right? So we have to figure out what to do with that. And ideally, it is this nutrient-rich resource that we would like to use and recycle, but storing it in just kind of, sometimes it'll be stored in these, I don't know, almost like an open lake. It's not the most lovely thing. That's going to enter into our systems. And so it's a big problem. I think we are working on it, but I think some of these digesters might be the best way to limit antibiotic exposure. That being said, they're expensive. So smaller scale farms are not going to be able to have the resources to invest in that. So we have to either provide subsidies to allow that, or think about some way of kind of pooling individual farms in that way. So thank you.
And if you think 100 pounds of poop times 300 cows, right? And that's not a huge dairy farm. It's a big dairy farm around here, but not a huge. Well, it's almost 8:10. I like to let people go have dinner, but I want to thank Jane for a remarkable conversation. Yeah. I hear it coming over the internet too. And thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to be back in real life. And I look forward to seeing you soon.